I was kidnapped by mistake. Mafia boss Viktor Dragunov looked at me as if I were prey tied up, then softly said, "Wrong girl. But you're mine now." I was just an ordinary legal assistant, with no knowledge of the dark world that hid secrets. But a mistake made by Viktor's men pulled me into a life that was completely foreign to me. They had kidnapped the wrong person, but Viktor Dragunov saw something valuable in me, for a reason I couldn't understand. I am Sophie Marlowe, the girl who was kidnapped by mistake, and now I belong to Viktor Dragunov. The streetlights were just starting to hum on the corner of Elm and Fifth, right where the bus stop always smelled like wet concrete and bad exhaust, and I was holding my worn-out briefcase, trying to quicken my step. It had been a 12-hour day dealing with probate paperwork and the kind of landlord disputes that just drain the color out of you, leaving you feeling thin and gray. And all I could think about was getting home to Bella, seeing her messy crayon drawings taped to the fridge, the ones with the disproportionately large suns, and making sure she ate something other than instant macaroni, maybe some real vegetables for once. I wasn't paying attention. You never are you, when something truly awful happens, when the seismic shift that ends your old life begins? Just as I was about to cross this huge, matte black car, the kind that looks more like a bulletproof battleship than a sedan, just slammed to a stop right in front of me, its engine idling with a heavy, dangerous thrum that vibrated up through the soles of my shoes, blocking the crosswalk completely, and making me jump back instinctively, before I could even register the sound, before the shockwave of the stop had fully passed. The back doors flew open with the synchronized click of high-end machinery, and two shadows, massive guys in suits that looked so expensive and so perfectly tailored they seemed too stiff to be real, were on me. I didn't even have time to scream, didn't have the breath in my lungs to form the sound. One had a hand like a vice, cold and unyielding, around my upper arm, twisting me off balance while the other pushed me hard from behind, a sudden brutal shove that took my feet out from under me. The next thing I knew, I was pitched headfirst into the back seat, the overwhelming smell of expensive European leather and something metallic and cold, maybe polished steel, maybe something worse, filling my nose and the door slamming shut with a thick, final, tomb-like sound that felt like the absolute end of the world closing in. My cheap vinyl briefcase clattered hard on the floor, and I could hear my heart hammering so hard against my ribs it felt like it might just break them, an uncontrolled drumbeat of sheer, raw terror. I tried to fight, of course, a desperate, pathetic flail, pushing my elbows back and twisting my torso against the crushing weight of the two men. I kicked out once, wildly, connecting with something hard and heavy, maybe a knee or a console, but the second guy, the one who smelled faintly of mint and stale cigarettes, just clamped down harder on my wrist, twisting it just enough to make me gasp and go instantly, painfully still, recognizing that any resistance was futile and only invited more pain. The car was already moving, fast, pulling away from the familiar hum of the city and the few remaining pedestrians, and the streetlights were blurring into streaks of gold and white outside the impenetrable tint of the windows, making the outside world feel distant and unreachable. "Take her to Victor's mansion, hurry!" a gruff voice commanded from the front, sounding impatient, annoyed, like they'd just been held up in traffic on the way to pick up dry cleaning or some other mundane chore that contrasted sharply with the sheer terror of my situation. My mind was screaming, absolute sheer panic and confusion battling for dominance, but no sound would come out. My throat was closed tight with fear, unable to expel even a whimper. I was a legal assistant. I chased down overdue bills, meticulously filed documents, and argued over parking tickets. My life revolved around procedure and predictable chaos. This sudden, violent intrusion was something out of a bad movie, only the terror was completely real, pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe, a suffocating weight. I tried to speak, to ask where they were taking me, to beg for release. But the man next to me, whose face was all jaw and no expression, whose eyes were fixed straight ahead with a professional vacancy, just shook his head slightly, an almost bored, clinical warning. It wasn't menacing, not in a theatrical way. It was just clinical, efficient, and devoid of humanity. like I was a package that needed routing to a specific warehouse, nothing more, and they were just doing their job, following directions to the letter. And the sheer, detached ordinariness of their ruthless efficiency was what finally made me stop struggling and just swallow the metallic, sickening taste of fear. The drive felt like forever, a terrifying tunnel of speed and silence, cutting through parts of the city I never saw, roads that got wider and darker and quieter, until the smooth asphalt gave way to the crunch of expensive gravel. We finally pulled up a long, winding driveway to this place. Mansion doesn't even begin to cover it. It was a fortress, all dark, rough-hewn stone and towering iron gates that looked impenetrable, set back against a heavily wooded hill, enormous and utterly silent under the cold night sky. The car stopped, the powerful engine instantly going quiet, and the heavy door opened again, revealing the intimidating height of the structure against the moon, which seemed small and distant above the eaves. They practically dragged me out, my legs stiff, shaky and unsteady from the shock, and walked me across a vast, polished marble foyer that was cold and impersonal, echoing deafeningly with every footstep, each sound amplifying my fear. We passed maybe half a dozen other men, all identically dressed in black suits, all looking like they were carved out of granite, with faces that held centuries of unspoken threat and a readiness to inflict violence. And every single one of them looked at me with this combination of dull curiosity and utter, withering contempt. It was the contempt that finally cut through the fear, sharper than any knife or threat. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here, you're nothing, you're trash, and we know it, and soon everyone will." We stopped in a huge, ornate living area, lit by a chandelier that sparkled like frozen stars, and the two guys who brought me were suddenly looking acutely nervous, glancing at each other, one clearing his throat awkwardly as he realized the depth of their mistake. The taller one, the one with the gruff voice from the car, finally muttered, his voice cracking slightly under the sudden pressure of their error. "Boss, we got her, but, we think there's been a mistake. The description doesn't fit the profile." And then they started to laugh, a low, ugly, relieved sound, directed at me. Not a full, booming laugh, but a kind of snicker that felt like a punch to the gut, a judgment on my worthlessness. "Yeah, she's definitely not the one he was looking for," the other guy chipped in, his voice dripping with condescension and professional disappointment, looking me up and down like I was a piece of refuse they'd tracked in on their expensive shoes, ruining the flawless marble floor. I felt my cheeks burn, a flush of humiliation rising hotly to my face, and I instinctively tightened my grip on the strap of my now dented briefcase. A small, involuntary, and profoundly quiet movement of dignity, refusing to shrink or cry, or give them the satisfaction of seeing me break under their hateful scrutiny. I might have been captured, but I wasn't going to let them see me crumble into the person they assumed I was. It was in that moment, right after the laughter died, and the echo of the snicker faded into the polished quiet, that the atmosphere in the room actually changed completely, signaling a presence far more dangerous than the men who held me captive. Not a dramatic, cinematic shift, just a sudden, profound stillness, like someone had abruptly muted the sound on a chaotic scene, replacing noise with the oppressive weight of a vacuum. And then he appeared. Viktor Dragunov. He wasn't loud, he didn't have to make a theatrical entrance or demand attention, but he was just there, stepping out of the shadows from a doorway I hadn't even noticed, and the silence he brought with him was heavier, more intimidating than any sound could have been. He was tall, formidable, and utterly cold, dressed in a charcoal suit that was tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin, accentuating the lean, dangerous strength beneath with zero room for imperfection. His eyes, the color of a stormy, frozen sea, swept over the room, pausing briefly on his nervous, clumsy men with a look of severe disappointment, and then they landed heavily on me. He listened impassively, without so much as blinking, as the tall guy stammered out the story of the mix-up. Something about a similar name in the firm's directory, or a transposed street number that led them to the wrong target. Details I couldn't even process because his gaze was so heavy. so intense. So deeply analytical, it felt like a physical weight pressing on my chest, pinning me in place as he evaluated my every feature. When the man finished, Victor didn't speak immediately. He just walked, slowly, deliberately toward me, the sound of his expensive leather shoes muffled by the thick rug. An unnerving, measured pace. He didn't rush, didn't threaten, but every step was a declaration of power and absolute certainty. And all the mockery and smirking disdain drained instantly out of the room like bathwater, leaving only pure, crystalline tension between him and me. He stopped maybe 2 feet away from me, close enough that I could smell the faint, expensive scent of his cologne, something sharp, like aged cedar, gunpowder, and ice, an aggressive scent that spoke of clean power. He wasn't assessing me as a woman, or even as a simple hostage, but with pure, cold calculation, the way a master engineer studies a component that was accidentally delivered, but might, unexpectedly, fit the mechanism or even improve the overall design. I didn't drop my gaze, even though every instinct screamed at me to look away, to become small, to hide my fear and the pounding in my ears. I just stood there, jaw set so tightly it ached, my hands still gripping the handle of the briefcase, my one tangible link to my old, structured life, waiting for his final, terrible judgment. That quiet strength, that stubborn refusal to submit or plead even when utterly outmatched, must have been what genuinely caught his attention, because a flicker, the barest hint of something unreadable, maybe curiosity, maybe profound surprise, crossed his face, gone in an instant, replaced by that familiar cold mask. He leaned in just slightly, his voice a low, rough rumble that carried clearly and finely in the suddenly too quiet room, and he spoke those words that would change everything, the ones that still echo with terrifying finality. Wrong girl. But you're mine now. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The declaration was final, absolute, and profoundly possessive, like laying claim to a newly discovered resource. Before I could find my voice, before I could even formulate the question of why he would bother with a mistake when his time was clearly so valuable, he straightened up and gestured to one of the men who had just entered the room, a guy named Sasha Vasilyev, who was tall, quiet, and looked far more competent and lethal than the buffoons who had abducted me, his eyes holding a distinct, professional watchfulness. Victor gave Sasha a simple, chilling instruction. I would be held in the mansion until they found the real girl he was searching for, but in the meantime I was his property now, under Sasha's direct guard, and was to be treated with a detached professionalism. Just like that, my life as I knew it was over, replaced by a terrifying, inexplicable imprisonment, a mistake that had been ratified by the fiat of a man who owned the darkness, and I was now tasked with merely surviving his whim. Look, this is a lot. I know. It's hard to wrap your head around, and honestly, sometimes I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't lived through every cold, terrifying second, every whispered insult, every calculating glance. Everything changed for me in that moment, in the space between 2 breaths, when a mistake turned into a chain that bound me to the shadows of a world I never knew existed, a world of permanent consequence. Before I dive into what happened next, because trust me, it gets worse before it gets better, and the psychological games were often harder than the fear itself, demanding a constant, exhausting vigilance. If you're watching this and feeling that knot of disbelief in your own stomach, feeling that chilling echo of what it's like to be unseen until someone powerful decides they want you, and suddenly your only value is your proximity to them, take a second. Just reach for your phone, hit that like button to let me know you're here with me, that you understand this feeling of utter displacement and sudden unwelcome spotlight, and please leave a comment below. It makes such a difference to see your comments, to know I'm sharing this with people who get it, who have felt the harsh judgment of the world. And if you want to walk with me through the rest of this story, through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing, please hit subscribe. I'll take a deep breath, steel myself for the memories, and we'll keep going, okay? Sasha, Victor's most trusted enforcer, the one with the face that was somehow both brutal and strangely careful all at once, ushered me out of the main room and led me down a winding, silent corridor. He didn't offer comfort or menace. He was just an escort. He wasn't overtly cruel, but his absolute silence and efficient lack of emotion were unnerving. Far worse than the loud, clumsy mocking of the initial kidnappers, because it implied a cold, unquestioning capability. He settled me into a lavish guest suite, which felt less like a bedroom and more like a cage upholstered in velvet and silk, designed for a captive bird meant to be admired but never touched. I was locked up, sure, but I was surrounded by a nauseating level of luxury that felt totally alien to me. A constant, abrasive reminder of the chasm between my humble life and this prison. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was a prisoner in a room nicer than any five-star hotel I'd ever dreamed of staying in. A room with a Persian rug, a private terrace, and a view of a manicured lawn. Yet I was utterly without freedom or hope. And I spent the first night sitting rigidly on the very edge of a bed that could comfortably sleep 3 people, unable to touch the embroidered pillows, clutching my briefcase like it was a lifeline to my old life, to my sister, to everything familiar and safe. The real grinding humiliation, though, started the very next morning when I was moved into the daily routine of the house. I was periodically paraded through the house, not quite introduced to the staff and guards, but pointed out with a casual wave of Sasha's hand whenever anyone asked. The men, Victor's crew, these terrifying, powerful figures who valued strength and money above all else, they didn't even try to hide their disdain, their eyes full of judgmental calculation as they dismissed me as inconsequential. They would stop their conversations instantly when I walked by. Then their eyes, cold and assessing, would follow me until I turned a corner. And as soon as I passed out of sight, I could hear the low, ugly chuckles and whispers start up again, the sound traveling surprisingly far down the marble halls, making me feel exposed and judged. I heard the specific comments, the ones designed to carry just far enough to sting like tiny, sharp needles piercing my self-worth. The boss is keeping the wrong girl. Must be losing it over a joke, one would say, with a snicker suggesting weakness, and another would chime in with heavy sarcasm, dismissing my entire existence. She's what? A legal secretary? Nothing special, just a clerical mistake, useful only for cleaning up paperwork. I started realizing that the luxury was part of the prison, a way to emphasize my low status. I felt like a cheap watercolor hung in a gallery full of oils, utterly out of place. This mansion was a well-oiled machine, and I, the legal assistant who specialized in organization, began to see the gears turning. Sasha's men, the lower-level enforcers, were clockwork. Their shifts were precise, their routines predictable, almost military. But their security protocols were focused entirely on external threats and high-value internal assets, like the vault or Victor's private study. I quickly realized they treated me as a non-entity, something so insignificant they barely guarded me at all, which paradoxically made me feel both safer and more deeply humiliated. It was the lack of regard that was the worst insult. I tried to find a familiar face, a servant, anyone who might offer a flicker of common decency. But everyone was either too terrified of Victor or too steeped in the culture of contempt to look me in the eye for longer than a second. It was an isolation chamber lined with silk. One guy, a greasy-looking, mid-level thug with a gold chain thicker than my thumb and a diamond earring that caught the light, cornered me near the grand staircase while I was trying to pretend to be intensely interested in a hideous, oversized bronze statue in the hallway, focusing on its flaws. He didn't shout, keeping the intimidation low and precise, but his voice was low, conspiratorial, and meant to wound deeply, to puncture my last shred of quiet dignity. "I don't know what she's done to make the boss keep her," he whispered, his eyes lingering on my simple, slightly rumpled work clothes, my worn loafer shoes, and my non-designer bag, pausing long enough to make the assessment brutal and final. Maybe she's the one who gets to fetch his dry cleaning, or the one who makes his coffee. Yeah, that's it. The accidental barista, polishing his silverware because she knows how to work with her hands. The implication was clear, heavy, and crushing. I was utterly useless. I was a flavorless mistake that Victor kept around for some pathetic, low-level service function. A walking, breathing reminder of his own power to retain even the most disposable of people. A symbol of his ability to waste resources. My jaw actually ached from how tightly I was clenching my teeth. A painful, physical response to the wave of humiliation. I just focused intensely on the marble floor, on the tiny, almost invisible hairline crack running through the perfect stone right beneath my worn loafer, concentrating on that small imperfection as if it held the entire secret of the universe. And I didn't say a word, refusing to confirm his low opinion of me. I didn't raise my eyes, didn't meet his taunting gaze, and most importantly, I didn't beg for respect or lash out in impotent anger, which would have been exactly what he wanted. I just adjusted the strap of my briefcase again, a small, defiant act of holding on to my own space and structure, and then I slowly, deliberately, walked past him and into the silent refuge of the library, without accelerating my pace or changing my posture, forcing him to hold his position and watch me retreat with calm indifference. It was hard, resisting the urge to snap back, to scream the truth of my character at him. But I knew in this world, words were weaknesses, and my calm, steady silence was the only power I had left, the only boundary I could enforce, and the only dignity I could retain. The absolute worst moment, the one that truly broke through my quiet defense and showed me how low and dangerous my situation truly was, occurred when Bella was brought into it, shattering the protective emotional wall I had erected around myself. They hadn't harmed her, thank God, but they brought her because they needed additional, undeniable leverage against the real target. Some way to force the intended girl to show herself, or perhaps just to test Victor's resolve and see if he'd break under the added pressure. Sasha himself, looking oddly uncomfortable, his typically emotionless face betraying a faint disturbance, brought my 5-year-old sister into the mansion one late afternoon, and seeing her tiny, frail frame dwarfed by that massive, intimidating foyer, her sweet face pale with confusion and searching desperately for mine, was like a physical blow directly to the chest, leaving me breathless and cold. She wasn't dragged. Sasha actually held her hand with a startling, gentle care, a strange flicker of humanity. But the reason she was there, the absolute disregard for her innocence and the callous use of her as a tool, was horrifying, an unforgivable intrusion. When Victor's men found out that this small, sweet girl was my sister, the accidental hostage's sister, they didn't see an innocent child. They saw more fuel for their cruel, demoralizing humor, another chance to diminish me. They openly laughed, pointing, calling her the mini-pawn, and joking loudly about how Victor now had a buy-one-get-one-free deal on useless, low-value hostages, confirming their belief in my worthlessness. The same gold chain guy walked right up to Bella, who was hiding desperately behind my legs, and mock-bowed with an elaborate, mocking flourish, saying loudly, clearly trying to wound me through her, "Welcome to the mansion, rejected one's sister. Hope you like stale crusts and quiet desperation, because that's all you'll find here." I felt my entire world collapse into a pinprick of focused rage and despair. I pulled Bella tight against my body, sheltering her small head with my hand, shielding her from the spectacle, and looked around at their smirking, brutal faces, fighting the urge to lash out, abandoned. That's what I felt, completely and utterly alone in a den of predators, like a worthless object, not just thrown aside myself, but actively dragging my precious, innocent sister down into the dirt with me, ruining her chance at a normal life. In their eyes, I wasn't just unimportant. I was toxic, contaminating everything I touched with my poverty and my lack of status. Bella, though, was the one who unexpectedly saved me from sinking into that consuming abyss of self-pity and despair, grounding me instantly in the present moment. She clung to me fiercely at first, yes. But after the initial shock and the immediate terror of the new surroundings, she started looking around the gaudy, overwhelming space with a child's intense, untainted curiosity, a lifeline back to normalcy. She pointed up at a massive, ornate chandelier hanging above us, its crystal facets refracting the afternoon light into rainbows on the polished floor, and whispered, her voice full of awe, "Look, Soph, so many tiny, tiny stars that don't move. It's like a ceiling full of magic." Her simple wonder was a sharp, clear counterpoint to the ugliness and cynicism surrounding us, a reminder of what truly mattered. That evening, after I'd managed to get her settled in my gilded cage, helping her set up her little drawing station with the paper and crayons Sasha had surprisingly provided, I noticed Victor. He wasn't looking at me with the usual cold calculation, nor was he looking at the mocking men. He was watching us, standing completely motionless. I noticed him standing just inside the doorway of the library, observing Bella drawing furiously on a huge pad of paper, using crayons that were brighter and more vibrant than anything we owned at home, filling the paper with colors. Bella was completely oblivious to his formidable, powerful presence, humming a little tune and fiercely concentrating on a lopsided picture of a huge, smiling house with an equally huge, friendly sun. A child's desperate attempt to bring warmth into the cold space. When he finally noticed me watching him, his eyes lifting and meeting mine, he gave a curt nod, nothing more, the barest sign of acknowledgement, and then turned to walk away, dissolving back into the shadows of the library's shelves. But in that brief, silent exchange, I saw something new, something that transcended his professional coldness. It wasn't pity. It was a kind of professional recognition, a value assessment, not of my beauty or wealth, but of my capacity for devotion. A man like Victor, ruthless and powerful, didn't waste his time observing anything that didn't matter, didn't spend his energy on fleeting sentimentality. The fact that he was observing, not commanding or threatening, suggested that my quiet, desperate resilience, the way I shielded Bella, the way I refused to engage with his mocking men, was registering as a sign of deep character. I was still a mistake, still the rejected one. But maybe, just maybe, my refusal to break, my inherent fortitude, was slowly altering the cold calculations of the most dangerous man in the room, proving that a quiet strength, fueled by love, can be more valuable than loud, flashy power, something he might even recognize in himself. The aftermath of that silent observation of Bella, and the quiet exchange with Victor, changed the dynamic entirely, shifting my mindset from victimhood to active strategy. I was still a prisoner, absolutely. But I stopped viewing the mansion solely as a gilded prison and started seeing it as a territory, a complex ecosystem, and Victor's world not just as a nightmare, but as a rigid structure with rules, however dark and unwritten, that could be exploited. I realized that my value, in this place, wasn't about being the right girl, but about being the unexpected one, the one who could see the structure beneath the superficial fear and cruelty. I was no longer just waiting to be rescued or discarded. I became an active observer and analyst. I watched the flow of guard traffic, the precise timing of their changeovers, the way different men spoke to Victor versus how they spoke to Sasha, picking up the small, subtle signs of power, deference, and weakness that governed their every interaction. My background as a legal assistant, my job of noticing small discrepancies in financial documents and timelines, kicked in hard, engaging my brain for the first time since the kidnapping, offering a lifeline of familiar competence. I started seeing patterns in the men's schedules, noticing things that the men, blinded by their own arrogance and entitlement, missed because they only looked for overt threats and ignored the mundane. The walls of the mansion weren't built solely to keep secrets out. They were built to keep secrets in, concealed within the routines and the paperwork, and I was now inside. An accidental spy with a knack for details, ready to turn my clerical skills into a survival mechanism. I started utilizing the library daily, not for reading, but for observation and for mapping the building's internal logic. It offered a vantage point over the main courtyard, crucial for tracking movement, and it had strangely thin walls near the security room, allowing me to pick up muffled sounds. I would sit there for hours, pretending to read a massive, leather-bound volume on ancient history, while my ears and mind were fully focused on the low, monotonous chatter of the guards and the occasional muffled phone calls from Sasha's nearby office, where he clearly dealt with all the operational details. I learned the names, the habits, the vulnerabilities. For instance, the night shift leader, a perpetually exhausted man named Sergei, always took a 17-minute smoke break at 2:15 a.m., coinciding precisely with a camera system reboot cycle when external perimeter vision went dark for a few crucial seconds. I mentally logged every tiny detail, building a complex, almost obsessive profile of the security structure, noting the placement of every keypad, every pressure plate, every window that didn't have a sensor. I felt safer out in the vast, neglected garden than I ever did inside the sterile, controlled luxury of the house. It was huge, overgrown, wild in a way the rest of the meticulously manicured estate wasn't, full of high hedges and crumbling stone paths that led nowhere useful, a place where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten things. One afternoon, I was sitting on a crumbling stone bench, pulling a few stubborn weeds out of the path, just to have something useful and grounding to do with my hands, when I felt that familiar, heavy shift in the air, the sudden, charged stillness that signaled a powerful presence, a man who moved without announcing himself. I didn't need to look up to know he was there. I just felt the silence deepen, the very air becoming thicker, more concentrated around him. Victor appeared, walking toward me slowly, deliberately. He didn't sit down, didn't shout an order. He just stood next to the bench, his hands in the pockets of his beautifully tailored trousers, looking out at the tangled rose bushes that were struggling to survive, their thorns sharp and unforgiving. It was the longest nonverbal interaction we'd ever had. Maybe a full 5 minutes of just silent, shared presence, and it was strangely, inexplicably calming. A quiet eye in the storm of fear, a silent recognition of shared intensity. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost contemplative, completely devoid of the usual ice and command, sounding less like a Mafia boss and more like a weary general. "You're not the one I intended to kidnap," he began, confirming what I already knew, but hearing him say it directly, without a command attached, was jarringly honest, cutting through the layers of pretense. He shifted his weight, still looking at the garden's decay, as if it mirrored his own world. The girl I wanted, she would have screamed. She would have negotiated immediately, calculating her best price within the hour, seeking advantage. She would have tried to bribe the driver within 5 minutes of leaving the curb, offering him a new life. He paused, and for the first time he turned his head to look directly at me, his eyes piercing through the afternoon sun that filtered through the leaves, seeking something deep inside me, searching for the anomaly. "You didn't scream. You didn't beg. You just walked away from the mockery, forcing them to look away. You protect your sister like a lioness protects a cub, without making a sound about it, without demanding praise or reward." He took his hands out of his pockets, and I saw a scar that ran along the back of one of them, thick and white against his tanned skin, a physical mark of the violence he lived by. "You could learn to survive in this world, Sophie. You could become something great, not in spite of who you are, a humble legal assistant, but because of your quiet mind, your discipline, and your lack of ambition for attention." His words hung in the warm, scented air of the neglected garden. He wasn't suggesting an escape or offering immediate freedom. He was offering a terrifying form of respect, a recognition of my inner backbone, and it was a confusing mix of validation and danger, a terrifying job offer. Victor wasn't the simple monster I had imagined, not entirely, but he was clearly far too complicated, a man whose dark, logical code I couldn't possibly hope to decipher, and I found myself drawn, despite the terror, to the challenging, recognizing glint in his eyes, a feeling of being finally seen. That conversation, quiet and charged as it was, sealed the new dynamic, and gave me a sense of purpose beyond fear. I was no longer just the accidental captive. I was the unexpected asset, the one who saw the world differently, with the detachment of an analyst. I started viewing the house as a vast, complex mechanism I was forced to master, understanding that if I could solve its problems, I could survive. But the external forces of his world were not done testing me, and they used me as their latest weapon. One evening, there was a massive gathering, one of the obligatory power summits he had to host. A truly formal affair, the kind where everyone wore suits that cost more than I made in a year, draped in the kind of casual wealth that felt aggressive and ostentatious. I was instructed by Sasha to stay out of the way, confined to the upper balcony of the library, far from the main action, but I couldn't resist a peek down at the ballroom, needing to see the threats in person. I saw the rivals and allies, the whole sinister, predatory ecosystem of Victor's world, gathered below, their faces masks of false conviviality and hidden threat. And that's when I saw Ivan Kovalchuk, Victor's arch-nemesis, the leader of a rival gang from Ukraine, a man whose reputation was built on theatrical cruelty and unbounded ambition, making his presence known through sheer volume. He was loud where Victor was quiet, all flashing teeth and tailored hostility, commanding attention with bluster. Kovalchuk noticed me immediately, somehow spotting my small, dark shape standing near the balcony railing, pretending to admire a piece of artwork on the wall, and realizing I was the source of the recent rumors about Victor's distraction. He stopped his conversation mid-sentence, his eyes locking onto mine with malicious glee, and then strode deliberately toward the foot of the staircase leading to the library, forcing a public confrontation. He didn't bother to lower his voice. In fact, he amplified it, making sure his contempt carried clearly. It was a calculated, very public humiliation, designed to wound Victor by hitting his weakest, most exposed link, me. He stood so close, looking up at me, that I could feel the heat radiating off his expensive, suffocating suit, and his eyes were full of contemptuous, brutal pity, a weaponized dismissal. "Look at this," he drawled, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear, gesturing at me with a lazy wave of his hand that dismissed my entire existence, like brushing away dust. "A regular, common girl like you caught the eye of a legendary Mafia boss? The great Dragunov has fallen for a secretary? How pathetic. How utterly low status to risk an empire for a trinket." He laughed, a short, sharp, cynical bark that made several heads turn and hushed the surrounding conversations, drawing every eye to me. He must truly be getting soft, Dragunov, if this is the best he can manage. She looks like she just came from filing tax returns at a strip mall office, clutching that sad briefcase utterly unremarkable. His words were like acid, scalding and intended to strip away every shred of my quiet self-respect, my hard-earned dignity, by placing me back in the category of unimportant civilian. He made me feel exactly what his men did, only amplified tenfold by his political power. Insignificant, a mistake, a low-status creature who dared to breathe the same air as him. My embarrassment was overwhelming. I felt a hot pressure behind my eyes, wanting desperately to shrink into the floor, to become truly invisible. But I didn't. I met his eye from the balcony, held his gaze steady across the vast room, and simply nodded once, a small movement of acknowledgement that treated his performance as merely a statement of fact, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, not giving him the satisfaction of a panicked reaction, or even a refusal. Kovalchuk faltered, just for a moment, his triumphant smile slipping, thrown by the complete lack of fear or anger in my expression, by my refusal to play the role of the humiliated mistress. He was used to hysterics, or submission, or defiant tears, but not calm indifference. I just looked at him, calmly, as if he were a client making an outrageous, unsupportable legal claim, waiting for him to conclude his irrelevant argument. And that cold, steady assessment was enough to make him sneer again and then pivot away abruptly, clearly irritated that he hadn't managed to draw blood or provoke a useful reaction. But the sting remained. A deep, painful ache that fueled my growing resolve. I was nothing in this power game, just an insignificant mistake, a footnote to their grand, ugly schemes, unless I did something to change my designation. His mockery, however, was the ultimate trigger, the final push I needed to transition from passive defense to active survival. That night, after the party had dispersed, and the mansion had fallen into its usual, ominous silence. I couldn't sleep. My mind was too engaged, too busy processing the details I'd absorbed. Kovalchuk's words had pushed me past the point of being a passive victim waiting for my fate. I was done being the mistake, the rejected one, the accessory he felt free to mock. I was a legal assistant. I knew how to find what people didn't want found, how to piece together fragmented evidence, how to analyze intent through paperwork. I started putting my clerical skills to work, not for escape. Bella's safety was my only priority now, and I couldn't risk moving her without ironclad protection. But for leverage and survival. I knew Sasha always left his office a mess, papers stacked high, always grabbing the wrong document for Victor, relying on his formidable memory rather than organization. A fatal flaw in a world built on secrets. One late night, around 3 a.m., when I knew the change of guard was happening, and the external security camera loops would be momentarily focused on the perimeter, creating a window of opportunity, I slipped out of my room, the lock proving trivial to my practiced hands. The lock wasn't much of a deterrent once I remembered an old credit card trick I'd read about years ago, a silly party trick now turned deadly serious. I found Sasha's office. It was tucked away in a remote wing no one seemed to use, and sure enough, it was exactly as disorganized as I expected. A beautiful, high-tech desk buried under mountains of disorganized chaos. I wasn't looking for money or a map. I was looking for the paper trail, the evidence of external operations and vulnerabilities. It took me 3 intense, agonizing hours, working by the glow of my phone set to the lowest brightness to avoid detection, forcing myself to read through confusing codes and foreign scripts. But I found it. Scrawled notes on water-damaged paper, encrypted communication transcripts with confusing code words, and most chillingly, a series of photographs of the mansion's lower foundation, with specific, circled markings and technical jargon about structural integrity. It wasn't immediately obvious, but when I crossed the timelines on the transcripts, with the dates on Kovalchuk's recent movements, information I'd overheard the guards discussing in the library, a clear, chilling plan began to form. Kovalchuk wasn't just here to mock Victor. He was planning a calculated, targeted attack on the mansion's weakest structural point, the service entrance foundations, during a major internal meeting, one that was set for the following week, the one that Victor was mandated to attend, meaning total collapse and maximum casualties. I found myself back in the garden the next morning, standing in the exact spot where Victor had spoken to me about my potential. The incriminating documents, photocopies I'd risked everything to make, clutched tight in my hand, damp with nervous sweat. My mind was racing with terrifying clarity. I could take this information and try to escape, use it as a bargaining chip for my freedom and Bella's immediate, final safety. But I knew that would only buy me minutes before Victor's retribution or Kovalchuk's success overtook me. Staying silent was a death sentence for us all, and I knew I couldn't live with that knowledge. I had a single, clear chance to prove I was more than a mistake, that I had value beyond his possessive declaration, and to leverage it for my only priority. I waited, the sun rising higher, illuminating the decaying roses and making the air thick and warm. And sure enough, just before noon, Victor walked past the edge of the garden on his way to a meeting, his presence immediately silencing the distant birdsong and drawing the attention of his detail. I stepped out onto the path, holding the papers up in a visible, non-threatening presentation. He stopped instantly, his eyes narrowing from the sun, his security detail tensing up around him like coiled springs, ready to neutralize any threat they perceived. "Victor," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt, cutting right through the crisp morning air like glass, demanding his singular focus. "I have information that will save your life, possibly your empire, but I need a guarantee first. Bella must be gone, safe, before you look at this. Promise me she will be relocated and protected permanently, somewhere you and Kovalchuk can never reach, with resources that will last her a lifetime." Victor was absolutely stunned, more surprised than I had ever seen him, his usual granite composure completely broken. I could see the shock flicker across his usually impassive granite face, a hairline crack in the marble that quickly vanished, replaced by an intense, burning focus. His bodyguards were already moving, reaching for the documents, trying to intercept the information before it reached the boss. But Victor put up a hand, stopping them instantly, commanding their obedience without a sound. He walked slowly toward me, the same deliberate pace as before, only this time the weight in the air was less about his inherent power and more about genuine, intense professional surprise, recognizing the gravity of the situation. He took the bundle of papers from my hand without breaking eye contact, analyzing my face for any hint of manipulation. He flipped through them, his eyes scanning the technical details, the location coordinates, and the transcribed codes, and with every page, his grip on the information tightened, his jaw hardening as he recognized the severity of the threat and the genius of the plot. He finally looked up, his gaze locking onto mine, searching, not for fear, but for the motive that drove this unexpected intervention. "You investigated me," he stated, his voice flat, dangerously quiet, not accusing, just utterly amazed by the audacity and the competence of the action taken by the woman he had dismissed as a clerical mistake. "Done," he agreed, simply, his focus returning instantly to his enforcer. "Sasha, arrange transport and security. Now. Permanent. No expense spared, no trace left. Execute her request immediately. Use the Cyprus asset funds." He didn't question my intelligence, didn't try to minimize my request, or try to renegotiate the terms of my demand. He just accepted the absolute necessity of the terms of the deal, recognizing the value of the information. The exchange was a handshake for survival, a moment where the low-status legal assistant and the powerful Mafia boss stood on unexpectedly equal ground, and I saw his respect for my intelligence and bravery, something he never imagined a wrong girl could possess. He now saw me as a strategic ally, an irreplaceable asset, not just a captive. And the unspoken contract between us was sealed by Bella's immediate, successful relocation. The rumor mill in the mansion, however, was worse and more pervasive than any physical threat I had faced so far, its whispers spreading faster and doing more damage than bullets. My quiet dignity, my brief moment of strategic triumph, didn't matter to the cynical men of his organization. They only saw what they wanted to see. A woman who had managed to worm her way into Victor's business, using femininity or trickery, leveraging a mistake for personal gain. Whispers started almost immediately, spreading through the ranks like wildfire, fueled by jealousy, resentment, and the council's inherent distrust of emotion. Victor's rivals, sensing weakness, and even his own lieutenants, started talking openly about how he had become weak and soft, prioritizing a woman over cold business. They said he was losing his cold, logical edge, distracted and compromised by a civilian girl, the mistake, who had managed to manipulate him into compromising assets. The Cyprus fund transfer being a huge, visible sign of his lack of control. They claimed I was a massive liability, that I had sentimentalized the boss, forcing him into unwise choices and making him vulnerable to attack from rivals like Kovalchuk. I heard the gossip everywhere, in the dining hall, in the hallways, even in the shadows near the security desk, all condemning me for being a mere pawn whose presence was softening the Empire's impenetrable shield, making it a target. The looks I got now weren't just contemptuous. They were actively hostile, filled with blame and resentment, accusing me for the perceived instability and the risk to their own livelihoods. I felt the awful, painful weight of being used, of having my genuine bravery and intelligence twisted into a sign of weakness for the powerful man I had saved, undermining his authority. I felt like I was back to being a worthless object. Only this time, I wasn't just abandoned. I was a massive, public scapegoat, threatening the entire structure. The worst part of this period of intense scrutiny was that even Victor started showing visible signs of doubt and strain, a conflict tearing him apart between his nature and his commitment to me. The pressure from his senior council, these older, fiercely traditional figures who believed power should never, under any circumstances, be clouded by personal attachment or sentimentality, only logic and profit, was immense and relentless. I saw him on the phone constantly, his back turned to me, his posture rigid, the tone of his voice hard, defensive, arguing fiercely with unseen power brokers who cited the cost of the Cyprus funds and the public mockery. He started pulling away, spending more hours locked in his heavily guarded office, his demeanor becoming colder, more distant than it had been since the moment of the kidnapping, a retreat into his old, isolated self as he wrestled with the political fallout. One night I found him standing on the dark, massive balcony, looking out over the dark expanse of the sleeping city, and I could sense the deep, painful turmoil emanating from him, a rare fissure in his iron control. He finally turned and looked at me, and his stormy eyes were clouded with uncertainty. With the heavy weight of the world he carried and the demands of his legacy, the cost of protecting you, Sophie, the cost to the organization, the loyalty, the respect I am losing with every day that passes. He started, his voice heavy, then trailed off, running a hand through his dark hair, the gesture one of profound frustration, not anger directed at me, but at the situation. The unsaid question hung thick and palpable in the chilled night air, a desperate plea for clarification. Are you truly worth this risk? Is she truly important to me? Or is this just a costly folly? It was a betrayal, not of his word to protect Bella, which he had honored absolutely, but of the connection we had forged in the garden, a retreat back into the cold logic of his empire when he needed it most. I felt my heart sink, realizing that in his world, personal relationships were luxuries he might be forced to discard to retain his power. I was not only rejected in the eyes of his men, but I was now seen by Victor himself as a fundamental threat, a dangerous soft wedge driven into the absolute necessary coldness of his power structure, forcing him to choose between his empire and his heart. The internal tension came to a brutal head at the next massive council meeting, a huge, tense gathering where the atmosphere was thick with challenge, suspicion, and impending political conflict, a slow-motion coup. Victor was forced to face down the oldest, most powerful members of his organization, men who looked at me, standing near the back, with open hostility, their whispers about his sentimental folly, loud enough to carry, demanding my removal. I stood in the back of the room, near Sasha, observing the proceedings, knowing I was the silent, despised, and central subject of their high-stakes debate. It was a terrifying position to be in, feeling the combined oppressive weight of their judgment and resentment pressing down on Victor. The senior council member, the old man named Vasily, with eyes like chips of flint and a voice that commanded respect through sheer longevity, was making a long, impassioned speech about the necessity of absolute, impersonal ruthlessness, how any attachment led to compromises, and how my continued presence was fundamentally damaging Victor's reputation and authority among their peers. He practically sneered when he mentioned me, calling me a low-born distraction and a trophy of weakness that must be discarded before it infects the whole body. The air in the room was electric with anticipation, every single person waiting to see if Victor would finally cave, apologize, and discard me to appease the old guard and solidify his precarious position, choosing the pragmatic path. They wanted him to choose the empire over the woman, to revert to the man they understood. Victor listened, silent and perfectly still, radiating cold composure, letting the old man talk until he ran out of breath and fire, allowing every argument to be made so his rebuttal would be final. Then Victor stepped forward, his posture rigid, radiating a deep, controlled power that silenced the very walls, his gaze sweeping slowly over the room, holding the eyes of every man present, before settling finally and pointedly on Vasily, focusing the immense power of his attention entirely on the challenger. He didn't shout. He didn't issue threats. He spoke with the same low, resonant voice I had heard in the garden, only this time it carried the full, undeniable weight of absolute final authority, the voice of a man who has decided his future. He paused for a long, drawn-out moment, the kind of silence that made everyone in the room hold their breath, even the most seasoned guards, anticipating the end. Then, his eyes flickered to mine, A deliberate, public acknowledgement that sent a powerful shiver down my spine, a shock of recognition and pride that defied their rules, and he returned his attention to the council. He met Vasily's gaze, utterly unflinching, and declared in a voice that brooked no argument, "She's not my weakness." He let that sink in, the statement of power and defiance, before he delivered the final, stunning, career-defining declaration, one that completely overturned every established rule and expectation of his dark world. His voice dropped slightly. The intimacy of the statement meant for everyone and no one all at once. "She's my queen. She stays, and her safety is the only non-negotiable term of my leadership." The silence that followed wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was the sharp, shocking sound of a paradigm shift. The sound of an organization's internal rules being rewritten instantly, permanently. Vasily's mouth actually dropped open, frozen in mid-sentence, the shock paralyzing him, and the other council members exchanged looks of complete, terrified shock and submission, realizing the finality of the decision. Victor had not only validated my presence, he had publicly recognized me as an essential, non-negotiable part of his empire, his true partner, his equal in status, elevating me instantly from a despised pawn to the central, untouchable figure of his world. I felt a confusing rush of heat, pride, and terror, totally unprepared for such a public, absolute declaration of commitment. This was a turning point far beyond the emotional. It was a profound political act that cost him influence but gained him loyalty from the few who valued strength over tradition. It was a statement that he was rewriting the rules of the organization, defining his own power not by what he was willing to sacrifice, but by what he chose to protect and elevate. It wasn't just about possession anymore. It was about public commitment and respect. And in their brutal world, a public commitment of that nature was ironclad and deadly serious. My status, my safety, and my connection to Victor were now woven irrevocably into the fabric of his power structure. And suddenly, the men who had mocked me were looking shamefacedly at the floor, realizing they had been insulting the future wife and co-ruler of their boss. Sasha, standing next to me, gave the barest, almost imperceptible nod of genuine respect, a silent admission that he had been wrong about the low-born legal assistant. But the reprieve was tragically short-lived, because power plays always demand a final, bloody reckoning. And Kovalchuk, fueled by his humiliation at the council's failure to depose Victor and his own personal resentment toward the accidental queen, decided to raise the stakes one last, unforgivable time. He didn't attack Victor directly. He attacked the one thing Victor couldn't defend with brute force: his word and his sentiment. He abducted Bella. Sasha had followed Victor's initial order perfectly, moving her to a distant, heavily secured safe house in a completely different state, using the Cyprus funds for its impenetrable security. But Kovalchuk's reach was even longer, his network more insidious, and his desperation more reckless than we had realized. He had bribed or threatened someone within the perimeter team, a low-level cleaner or cook, someone invisible, proving that low-status people can hold high-stakes betrayal. The call came late that night, a static-laced line that cut through the mansion's usual silence, Kovalchuk's voice oily, triumphant, and thick with vengeance, his breathing heavy with anticipation. He didn't mince words. He didn't even try to hide his professional glee at creating this impossible choice for his rival. "The Empire or your woman, Dragunov? You can have your queen, but you must sacrifice your crown? Give up your claims, dissolve your council, or I take the girl," he demanded, the phrase hanging in the air like a heavy, final guillotine blade, giving Victor the impossible, classic choice of power over sentiment. My heart shattered instantly, crumbling into dust in my chest, and the fear was worse than the night I was taken, because this time it was Bella's life on the line. Despite Victor's brave public declaration, despite his defiance at the council, I truly believed that faced with total loss, he would choose the Empire, the logical, expected Mafia choice, the one that preserved the institution. A man who had built an empire on ruthless, cold logic simply could not, in the decisive, final moment, risk everything for a mistake he had merely chosen to keep. I looked at Victor, whose face was a mask of cold fury, his knuckles bone white against the phone receiver, his posture vibrating with suppressed violence, a deep internal conflict tearing him apart. I saw the flash of hesitation, the agonizing flicker of calculation that must always precede a life-and-death choice in his world, the brief, terrible moment where he weighed decades of work against a few months of connection. He could easily trade me, save his empire, and maintain his absolute power. The decision everyone in his world expected and would respect. But then I looked at the way he gripped the phone, the sheer, profound violence in his posture, the rage twisting his features, and I knew he wasn't calculating the loss. He was calculating the fight. He finally spoke, his voice dangerously low, stripped of all emotion, a pure, deadly threat directed into the receiver, sounding like ice grinding on stone. "Keep her safe, Kovalchuk. You lose both. You lose the girl and you lose your life, and I will take everything from you slowly." He slammed the phone down, the plastic cracking on the receiver, not even waiting for a response. He didn't hesitate to fight, refusing to lose me, refusing to let the most important person in my life be a casualty of their war. He chose commitment over convenience, love over logic, and in that moment, Viktor Dragunov, the cold, ruthless mafia boss, proved that his commitment to protect the woman he loved, the woman he chose, was far more powerful than any empire he had built or could ever own. The decisive action came fast, a massive, coordinated raid on Kovalchuk's main warehouse hideout, where Bella was being held in a grim, freezing cell deep in the basement. It was chaos, pure noise and light, the sounds of automatic gunfire and breaking glass filling the cold night air, the smell of cordite thick and acrid. Victor was in the absolute thick of it, moving with a terrifying, balletic efficiency, leading the charge with Sasha right behind him to get to Bella, ignoring his own safety. I insisted on going too, refusing to stay behind, knowing I was the only one who could truly understand the gravity of the risk. And Sasha, seeing the set of my jaw and the cold determination in my eyes, didn't even argue. He just tossed me a heavy, ill-fitting vest and a small, surprisingly familiar-looking handgun, a Glock, which felt solid and heavy in my hand, a terrible responsibility. My hands were shaking uncontrollably from the cold and the fear, but I remembered the feel of the paper in the garden, the taste of Kovalchuk's condescending mockery, and the feel of Bella's tiny, scared hand in mine. I was done being a victim. I was done being a pawn. As we fought our way through the maze of crates and shadows, the air thick with smoke and the metallic smell of blood, Victor took a heavy hit. It wasn't a bullet, but a strike from a large metal pipe wielded by one of Kovalchuk's desperate men, catching him hard on the side of the head, sending him sprawling, dazed and bleeding profusely, toward a stack of unstable pallets, dropping his weapon. Kovalchuk saw his opening, his final, desperate chance to win, by taking out the head of the snake. He raised his weapon, a massive, gleaming pistol, aiming it directly at Victor's exposed head, his face contorted in a final, triumphant snarl, his victory within reach, a dark shadow looming over Victor. It was over, but it wasn't. I saw it, the moment frozen in time, Victor momentarily defenseless, his vision swimming, struggling to reach his dropped weapon, Kovalchuk ready to deliver the final, killing blow, his finger tightening on the trigger. Instinct took over completely, the sheer, primal, protective instinct of a woman who had fought tooth and nail for her dignity and for her sister's safety. A fierce refusal to lose the man who had ultimately chosen her. I didn't think about the gun's weight, or my complete lack of training, or the overwhelming danger of the battlefield. I just aimed, holding the weapon with both hands, the training Sasha had occasionally offered me in the basement range kicking in, focusing intensely on the dark mass of Kovalchuk's body, and pulled the trigger, releasing the full force of my stored-up rage and protective fury. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack in the vast, echoing space, the kickback shocking and painful against my palms, but the effect was immediate and decisive. Kovalchuk stumbled, cried out in a high, guttural sound, dropping his weapon, clutching his shoulder as he fell heavily. his sneer replaced by a look of sheer, agonizing shock and disbelief that his end had come at the hands of the low-born distraction. I had saved Victor. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, Sasha and his men took down Kovalchuk's remaining guards, and the final scene was silent. The profound silence of total victory, broken only by the sound of Victor groaning as he pushed himself up, his eyes meeting mine in a look of complete, stunned gratitude and awe. I stood over the defeated Kovalchuk, the gun heavy and hot in my hand, and looked at the man who had called me pathetic, who had called me a mistake, and I didn't say a word. I just lowered the weapon, my quiet strength now undeniably clear, and walked toward Victor, who was already on his feet, pulling me into a fierce, protective embrace that was more acknowledgement and respect than passion. Bella was found moments later, terrified but unharmed, and the moment she saw me, her small arms wrapping fiercely around my waist, the whole dark, brutal world faded away, replaced by the simple, precious reality of holding her safe, which was all that mattered. The consequences for those who had wronged us were swift, final, and satisfyingly public, though not at my direct request or insistence. Victor didn't need to seek dramatic, vengeful action, because his world corrected itself, balancing the scales of justice with brutal, efficient logic. Kovalchuk didn't just lose the battle, he was completely exposed. The documents I had uncovered, which had been quickly passed to authorities through Victor's network as a cover story for the raid, revealed the extent of Kovalchuk's treachery and his alliances with rival international factions, instantly leading to a public scandal that dismantled his entire operation and reputation. Within a week, his name was mud, his allies scattered, and the empire he sought to steal crumbled into dust, a natural, permanent fallout of his own greed and misjudgment. As for the men in the mansion who had mocked me, the ones who had called me the rejected one and the low-born distraction, especially the greasy guy with the gold chain, they were quietly, systematically, removed from Victor's organization. Not killed, which would have made them martyrs, but stripped of their wealth, their status, and their influence, forced back into the obscurity from which they had climbed, their reputations ruined within the only world they cared about, reduced to nothingness. Their punishment wasn't blood, but the complete loss of the status they valued above all else, a visible, undeniable correction of their earlier hubris. I didn't gloat or linger over their fate. I didn't need to. I just walked through the mansion, the quiet woman still in her simple clothes, but now standing beside Victor as his acknowledged partner and co-ruler, and their terrified silence was all the acknowledgement I needed of my undeniable new position. My quiet dignity had been tested, mocked, and almost destroyed, but it survived, and now it was recognized, not just tolerated, but celebrated as the necessary core of his strength, the quiet mind that saved the whole enterprise. I became Victor's partner, his true partner in every sense, not just his wife in name, but his queen in the true political sense of the word, standing side by side with him, my intelligence and quiet resilience a necessary and irreplaceable complement to his formidable, ruthless power. We built a life, protected and private, where Bella could thrive, her crayon drawings now taped up in a magnificent kitchen, and the dark world of power and shadows was something we managed, together, without letting it consume the light we were creating for her. Sometimes, I still think back to that moment on the street, the cold leather, the terrifying speed of the car, and Victor's voice saying I was his. It was a mistake, an accidental twist of fate that pulled me violently from a life of quiet anonymity into a world of impossible stakes and unimaginable power. But in that chaos, I found a strength I never knew I had, a fierce, protective core, and I found a fierce, complicated man who saw that strength and refused to let it go, risking his world for it. We built our future not on romance or fantasy, but on a foundation of mutual, earned respect and sheer survival, recognizing that true power wasn't found in a crown or a gun, but in the heart that refuses to break, the mind that refuses to shrink, and the commitment that never wavers. You know, It's a strange feeling, looking back at who I was then, holding that worn-out briefcase, trying desperately to disappear into the crowd of the unseen. Maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've felt invisible, judged for what you wear or where you come from. Maybe you've been called a mistake when you were actually the key all along. But let me tell you this. From where I stand now, you were never small. You were never unimportant. The quiet ones, the underestimated ones, we are the ones who change the calculations of the powerful. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.